I've saved this lecture for our final lecture. You are all my advanced students. I think you're capable of understanding what I'm talking about, but this is going to be a hard one to talk about. Atmosphere I'm referring to in the sense of literally the Earth's atmosphere. But I'm also referring to it in terms of emotional tone. For instance, in these lectures, I try to create an atmosphere of curiosity. So think of atmosphere in both of those ways. The first artist we're going to look at, Jacob Ruisdael, is probably the most famous artist you've never heard of. He's a sort of foundational landscape painter, and because he was Dutch, and remember, Dutch painters fit in categories. They have a kind of marketing kind of approach towards things. They're very commercial about painting, and each of them sort of gets a niche in that market. His niche is landscape. Landscape is a kind of new category in the history of painting. Anyway, he's faced with the issue of being a landscape painter in the flattest country in Europe, which means, of course, that he's got all kinds of room in his canvases to paint atmosphere, to paint the sky. The other thing I want to remind you about is that landscape painting in this time that we're talking about is not out of doors. All landscape paintings you see from this era are done indoors, not in front of a landscape. Sometimes they're an observed landscape, sometimes they're not. Again, maybe he got bored with Dutch landscapes. Towards the end of his career, he painted over 1,000 Scandinavian landscapes. And he'd never been to Scandinavia. So I want you to begin to kind of understand that these landscape paintings, they refer to life, real life, but in fact they're inventions. And that'll help you segue into the second artist we'll be looking at today. This is one of his very early landscapes. As you can see, he captures the character of the Dutch landscape, fertile, civilized, always a reference to some sort of town, often in the background. And quite naturally, there's a natural color difference between the huge amount of sky that's represented and the land itself. Almost always you'll see some tower in the background, and in fact that, of course, is the church steeple. This is Holland, so it's Dutch Reformed faith. The churches, by other European standards, are rather bare, but in fact they're quite large in the prominent center of town. But you can see this sky that you're looking at that looks so believable is in fact simply his own creation. Even if you were out there, the sky wouldn't stay still enough for you to be able to paint it as it actually was. And of course, the contrast in these paintings, that's okay, go to the next one, The contrast in these paintings is not only color, but weight. The dark values that are associated with the ground, dark values usually imply a physical heaviness, physical weight, a density. And then, of course, the sky itself is a much lighter value. One other point I'd like to make, these Dutch painters were so specialized that if you look carefully, you will see there's a road here, and then there's a figure, maybe two or even three figures on that road. Whenever you see figures in his paintings, and typically they're quite small, he didn't paint them. One of his students painted them because one of his students, Hobema, was a figure painter. And so the categories stayed as categories. Again, you get a sense of, just by the very nature of the painting, the medium itself is handled in what we call a painterly way. If you look at that road, you see all the graininess of texture of the paint. This was pretty typical of the Dutch tradition, and Rembrandt was, of course, the person who most dominated that. In some ways, Ruisdael, during his own era, was as well known as Rembrandt was. And his paintings sold for very high price. Can we see the next one, please? I thought I figured at some point I had to show you a windmill. And this again, of course, is a manufactured scene. But even given the dominance of the windmill, and by the way, notice the three figures on the road. He brings figures in, and actually there are a couple other figures here and here. I'm going to step on one of these lights again, and there. He makes the landscapes habitable. He tries to humanize them, so we feel comfortable in that spatial environment. But almost always, the figures are background things. So nature becomes more important than humanity. It's the whole intention here is to create some sense of kind of awe and wonder. The nature is more than we are, it's bigger than we are, and so on. It's no accident that Ruisdael became the father of what we would call modern landscape painting. The English painters, Copley, Turner, were very much influenced by Ruisdael. The American painters, Church and Cole were also influenced by Ruisdael. And of course now we're getting water, which is a new element in the scene. And I think you also realize the same thing applies to seascapes as it does to landscapes. Whenever you see a seascape, that's a totally invented painting. Can we see the next one, please? This work is probably his most famous work, the Jewish cemetery. Now, my sources have not told me much about the status of Jews in Holland at the time. Sometimes they're a relatively favored position in European society. Other times they're ostracized. So I can't say very much about it, but my guess is that the Jewish community is a minority community in Holland. And what we see here is a cemetery that has been sort of blasted by time and the weather. So it, as I say, all of his paintings are meant to be sort of humanized nature. Now, in this particular painting, he gives us a sense of some sort of human history here. Notice the rainbow in the background. Apparently, there's been some kind of fierce storm here. If you look in the foreground on the lower left side here, you see a little rivulet coming down there, and that's probably the afterflow from the storm. You have this neglected building in the background. Given its shape, it appears to be a church. And keep in mind, in that world, people got buried by churches. The original tradition in the Christian faith was saints get buried in the coffin, and then once you've run out of, or on the altar, and then once you've run out of altars, you start to bury saints in the pavement of the church. And by the time you get to America, you, especially in Catholic churches, if you go around in the countryside, you often see Catholic churches surrounded by a cemetery. That's part of that tradition. Now, here, you notice the landscape is kind of rugged, much more rugged than a real Dutch landscape would probably be. And there are evidences beyond that little stream that's flowing of the fact that this was a kind of violent storm. You see the sky itself is dark. The clouds are kind of gusting and they look rather turbulent. And we have a broken tree here. You see the break right there. And it's fallen over on a tomb here. And that looks like a marker that has been flooded. So you get a sense of the passing of human life and in a way the passing of nature. Again, the whole idea is some sort of a human connection here. In this case, the fact that he's representing a minority starts to create a certain kind of separation and even a certain sense of stillness and loneliness. What you get here is the evidence of the violence of the storm, but what we actually see right now appears kind of the aftermath. And so, you know, he creates a kind of emotional atmosphere with those particular combinations. This again is one of his more famous paintings. The same format we saw in his earlier painting, the big sky, flat land, the church in the background. He was buried there. It's Haarlem, but he also, he grew up in Haarlem, but he painted most of his life in Amsterdam because there was a much bigger market for his painting in Amsterdam. He was buried there, and you actually see something here that seems a little strange to us. The bleaching of cloth was done by laying fabric out in the sunlight, and they use the sun to bleach it. So you see those sort of rectangular shapes, and if you look carefully, you see these minute little figures in that area. This was the process they used to bleach cloth. This water you see, to the left a little bit, you see there's some more blue reflecting the sky, and it appears to be some sort of a pond or something like that. But again, look at that sky. That's where he has all his fun when he's painting. He can just play around in the sky and create whatever atmosphere he chooses to. And there's a kind of dramatic quality to the space he creates, because the land comes right up to us. And in fact, you get a sense of that because you have linear perspective in these large pieces of cloth that are lying on the ground there. So you get a feeling of the space coming right towards us. And then, of course, the sky races backwards in this giant shape. But there's an irony about it. Darks tend to go back in space, and lights come towards us. And so even though it's a pastoral scene, there's a kind of formal tension there. Now, I'm talking about this painting structurally. Ruisdael probably wouldn't talk about it that way. But I've been educated in the 20th century. In fact, I've taught classes in formalism, where we take paintings and sculptures and analyze them structurally. We analyze what the artist is doing with the visual elements. The visual elements are shape, color, line, value, etc. And those are the things artists organize. I'm saying that because I'm trying to help you understand. I'm preparing you for the next artist we're going to look at, and it help you understand why I've grouped these two artists, because the next artist we're going to look at works only with form, does not work with subject matter at all. But I want you to sense that artists who work with subject matter think as much about shape and what color does and what value does as artists who function in more abstract mode. Now, I think this is our last Ruisdael. Some of you might ask me what a water mill is. I simply don't know. It's you think of a water wheel as, churning and then creating some sort of a grinding process. So they're usually associated with grinding grain and things like that. But I don't know what a water mill is. Does that do something about furnishing drinking water? I honestly don't know. But again, you see, now he's given us a time of year, and of course we all can identify with this, with the snow on the ground and the temperature today. And look at that dark, brooding winter sky. And again, if you look carefully, you see people in the landscape. And I don't know if that's what that is there next to the one appears to be a female figure. I assume it's a dog, but it looks more like a bear to me than it does a dog. You see the two figures in this foreground area? Yeah, there you go. And I guess it's a very big dog. You can see he paints, in this particular painting, he's developed the painting in a very thin layer of paint. You see that pebbly texture? That's the graining of the canvas. That's the weave of the canvas. And so this entire painting is a thin kind of transparency, a kind of almost a winter illusion. And you'll notice a couple other figures in the background as well. And of course, you'd have your typical church steeple up on the top left there. And again, he brings foreground subjects in, these broken logs we see in the foreground. He brings that in to simply give us a sense of exaggerated space. And so that whole spatial experience is what the painting is about. It's not just about the description of these objects and our association with those objects. Now, can we see the next one, please? We're moving on to Mark Rothko, who's a more contemporary artist. You'll notice his dates. His original name was Markus Rothkowitz. He grew up in Latvia, came to this country, I think it was 1913. I need to say a little bit about him. He's a very difficult personality. He's a big drinker. He's a brilliant guy. He graduates from Yale, never goes to classes, and occasionally reads a book and is able to graduate from Yale. He knows 3 or 4 languages. His family came in on the West Coast in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. He was educated in Portland, Oregon, and then he got a scholarship to Yale. He reads all the time, and mostly classic literature. He reads major philosophers, reads in antiquity. He can read Latin. I mean, he's an amazing guy. But that intellectual part of who he is seems, at the first part of his life, to be the dominant thing. Doesn't seem that he's going to be an artist at all. So he's slow to develop as an artist. Now, I'll warn you one other thing about Rothko before we start to look at his work. Just as a sideline to this class, I've been occasionally telling you how much works of art sell for. With Rothko, I think there was a new record. One of Rothko's paintings sold for $168 million, one of his paintings. And by the way, when he died, and he committed suicide, by the way, he was a very moody, complex personality. Took overdose of barbiturates and died. He was in his 60s, early 70s, if I remember correctly, when he died. Any case, well, let's look at a work, and I can give you a little better sense of this developmental process. This is a relatively early work from 1945. He's in his 30s. Most artists become artists in their teens and 20s. This particular work is called Baptismal Scene, and it's fascinating. Remember now, he's Jewish, but he renounces the Jewish faith. His father was on again, off again Jew. When his father died, Rothko renounced his Jewish identity, and yet throughout his life, he seems to have a kind of fascination with religious reflection. And in this particular case, it's called a baptismal scene, If you look carefully at the top, you see a kind of swirl in the middle of the top of the painting with little forms coming up. That's supposedly a kind of baptismal fountain. The rest of it has strange little complex amoeba-like shapes that seem to squiggle about the surface. Notice the coloration is rather soft and light. The color doesn't seem to play a very strong role in this stage of his particular work. Now, this painting is derived. If you've ever been to the Cincinnati Art Institute and had lunch there, across from the dining hall, there's a giant painting there done by a surrealist, a Spanish surrealist, Juan Miró. And so surrealism, Salvador Dali being the other artist you might associate with surrealism. Surrealism is an established art movement, and it's dominant in New York, where he's moved now, and he's painting in New York. And so he's interested in this idea of these ancient images that somehow get put together in this irregular and non-logical kind of way. He, of course, has read all kinds of modern psychology. Now, can we see the next one, please? You'll notice this painting is a few years after the last painting. Also notice the scale of the painting, 80 inches by 66. That's a pretty substantial size painting. And notice now, the painting is mostly about color. Shapes are kind of predictable. That he works with some sort of a squarish format. And the colors and the colors of these paintings in this part of his career are almost always warm like this. Lots of oranges and reds. But then he does something to contrast them. You notice those two shapes that are blue-gray that have a much darker value. And those shapes start to kind of advance the warmth of the other colors. And of course, you have white or cream color shapes there that also kind of advance towards our eye. And he uses that white a little bit as a kind of edging on one of the forms. Anyway, this may seem like a very simple painting to you. In fact, it's much more complicated than his later paintings become. And one of the jobs I face as I stand in front of you and talk about art is I'm talking about a subject that's not meant to be talked about. I'm an artist myself. I'm a sculptor. The reason I make sculptures is because I say certain things in the sculpture that I can't say with words, and even though I'm fairly articulate. So I have to be able to stand in front of you and give you some kind of explanation to help you get at what the artist is trying to say. But we all do the best we can. In the modern era, what the artist is saying is pretty much associated with compositional structure, because of course there is no subject matter here. The painting is its own subject matter. Now can we see the next one? This particular work, by the way, notice the titles. The titles simply are the colors that are in the painting, because the painting is not about anything other than color. That's the subject. So he figures, well, that's what we'll title it, because normally we title a painting around the subject matter. Here you see this is a little more advanced in time, and you see he's doing the same thing he did in the last painting, warm colors, but then contrasted with some darker values, in this particular case, a kind of border between the bottom section, which are yellow and oranges, and the upper section, which is red. And you'll notice how, because of that contrast, you see the color more strongly where it's in contrast. So that border becomes a way of modulating the color. So it's not just a flat plane of color. But anyway, he's moved now to this very simple squarish format. And by the way, he didn't want his paintings framed. If there ever was a purist in painting, it was Rothko. He keeps working on simplifying the painting, stripping things away that he thinks are unnecessary. The frame, he thinks, is a distraction. So the painting is only about the painting. I don't want anything else to intervene or interfere with that. Now, one of the things that happens with a Rothko, they're almost always large. In a few moments, I'm going to show you some really big ones. Is the average person looks at this and says, what the hell is this? You know, you're expecting to see something. There's some reference to subject matter, something other than this colored fog. And so you start with that point of disappointment. But you've heard this guy is supposed to be big stuff. So there must be more here than I'm seeing. And so what typically happens, every person looks and looks, and you can almost get in a trance by looking at Rothko's. And that's what exactly he wants you to do. He wants you to be totally immersed in that color. And that's it. That's it, folks. Don't expect more than that from Rothko. But it's atmosphere, it's created atmosphere. It's a more vividly colored atmosphere than we saw with Ruisdael. But again, it's the same kind of technique of painting. Can we see the next one, please? I wanted you to see them. This is a later one where he's finally gotten down to the simplest possible format, minimal frame, and I wanted you to see it with a person to get a sense of the scale of the painting. The idea with a Rothko is you're supposed to have it totally fill your visual field. So you're supposed to stand kind of close to it. In fact, at one point, he recommended people stand 16 inches away from his paintings. Now, I should let you know something about Rothko paintings in the way he uses color. You'll notice he does a lot of yellow and orange, and in the early part of the career, he did a lot of red. But the problem with that was the particular red he picked was not a very stable red. Red is actually one of the hardest colors to stabilize. Some of you remember, as I do from my misspent youth, whenever you saw a red car, it was 3 or 4 years old, it was gray. Red, they couldn't find a way to stabilize the color red in automotive paint. Today, red cars pretty much stay red. But the red that Rothko used was not very stable. And the other thing you want to be aware of is that oil paintings should not be out in bright sunlight. One of the reasons museums are generally fairly dimly lit with only a little light over works of art, is that bright sunlight can damage the pigments. And any case, there's been all kinds of effort since these paintings have been made that had dominant red in them to find a way to bring them back to what they were when he initially made them. And I understand now someone came up with a lighting system that somehow brings out that original red. Can we see? Yes. This is the Rothko Chapel. It's curious. That's on a university campus in Texas, and it's a Catholic campus. Now, this is a guy who's Jewish and anti-religion, but he didn't have any problem at all of this chapel being located on this Catholic campus. The other thing I need to tell you about it, remember I said all along, he's a very fussy guy. He's a perfectionist. Early in his career, he got in a fight, a verbal fight, not physical. He was much too heavy to be much of an athletic fighter. He got in a big fight with a very famous American architect. That architect was named Philip Johnson. Some of you might have heard of him. He designed some major skyscrapers, two of whom in New York, the Seagram building, he designed that with a European architect, Mies van der Rohe. And then on his own, he designed the AT&T building, which, last I heard, was the most expensive skyscraper ever built. Anyway, Philip Johnson is a kind of architectural purist, just like Rothko is a painting purist. Now, it doesn't work well when you try to put two purists together. They actually commissioned Rothko to make a series of paintings for the Seagram building dining hall. It's a very exclusive building. It's the whiskey company, by the way. That's where the name comes from. Anyway, it's called the Four Seasons Restaurant, and he was to make these plain paintings such as you see here surrounding that restaurant. Anyway, the guy's very fussy about light. He didn't like the light in the room. The other part of it is, forget the fact that one of his paintings after he died sold for this odd sum. Most of his life, he lived a very poor life. He didn't have much money. He's a starving artist in New York. Almost no one's buying these kinds of paintings, as you might well imagine. And so he didn't like the idea. This is a fancy restaurant. It cost a fortune to eat here. He actually took his family to the restaurant. And I'm supposed to make all these paintings around the perimeter of this restaurant. Number one, I don't like the light here. There's too much sunlight. And by the way, the paintings are red. Overall color is red. If you've ever seen on public television, they did a makeover of the play that was Broadway play called Red, which was about this incident at the Four Seasons restaurant. Any case, he doesn't like the setting for his paintings. And Johnson is a very, very purist architect. It's got to be his way or the highway. And Rothko says, okay, we're done. I don't want my paintings in the space. They gave him a huge commission. He gave him back the entire commission and kept the paintings himself. Only later on did they get dispersed to some of the American museums. Now let me try to help you understand a little bit about how these paintings are done. First of all, he paints on raw canvas, and he paints in oil paints. And you're not supposed to do that, because oil paint rots canvas. He comes up with an odd formula of mixing, I think this sounds weird, but the glue you use to size a canvas is called rabbit's ear glue. I don't know if it's made out of rabbit's ears or what it is, but that's what it's named. Anyway, he finds a way to mix that with his pigments. So that somehow protects the canvas. So apparently these canvases are relatively stable. But what it does is the paint is not on the surface, it's in the surface. And remember, the theme of this lecture is the word atmosphere. He's trying to create this colored space that has a certain kind of depth to it. He's also doing something that a very, very, very famous painter invented hundreds of years ago. Leonardo da Vinci was the first of the Italian painters to work in oil paint. And he came up with an idea of glazing the painting. In other words, making very, very faint colors. The little bit of pigment mixed with a lot of linseed oil. And so it makes this very thin veil of color. But then he put another layer of color on top of that, and another layer on top of that. It's called glazing. If you've seen the Mona Lisa, the softness of her smile and her skin is created because of that kind of glazing process. Rothko does the same thing, but now without the figure and emphasizing the single visual element of color. He's eliminated shape now. Shape is only the shape of the canvas itself. And although these paintings look simple, they aren't simple. They're built up in very thin layers of paint, and each color interacts with the color beneath it. And so the results aren't always 100% predictable. In any case, getting back to our purist story, Philip Johnson was supposed to be originally the architect for this building. And him and Rothko got in a big fight, and he got fired. Johnson got fired. And so another architect came along and took over the commission. One of the things Rothko wanted that Johnson wasn't in favor of, he wanted a giant skylight because he did his paintings in his studio where he had a giant skylight. And so just above these two figures we see, there is a big, the room is octagonal in shape. It's nothing but paintings. It's a chapel, but it's a chapel to paint. It's a chapel to color. That's what you worship here. Anyway, the skylight above is what illuminates the room. You don't see much in the way of any artificial lights. It's meant to be naturally lit. And the color of the paintings, as you can see, they're now huge paintings. You're equipped with these benches in the space, and the whole idea is to simply absorb, again, I'll use our word, the atmosphere that he's created here. As if you're already in a cloud, in a kind of colored cloud. Now, by the way, I normally don't try to get in a critical mode during these lectures because I'm talking about artists who are far more important than I am. But in this case, what bothers me about this space, this is amazing paintings in some ways. I find the white wall distracting, frankly. That's all I see is that white wall, especially with these dark violet colors. And if I wish the wall were quieter in value so that the atmosphere of the room would be more consistent. I find it jarring, that white wall bouncing off the edge of these dark, massive paintings. Now remember, I mentioned to you that Rothko committed suicide. In his very end of his life, he did a series of paintings that even eliminated color. So this painting is not so much about color, it's about value. Value is darkness and lightness. And again, the title, Black on Gray. It probably represents his emotional mood, which obviously was not very cheerful at the time. And look at the edge where those two color fields meet. You notice there's a lighter kind of, actually a brushy look there that you normally don't see in his paintings. But again, it is what it is. I think there's more to it than most people imagine when they first see it. But at the same time, I understand if people get disappointed who aren't familiar with visual structure. You bring expectations to a painting that all of us bring, and I included. And if those expectations get disappointed, we have to rethink what's going on here. And that's what a Rothko painting does. It sort of, in its dumb, numb way, asks us questions. What is this? What is art? What am I looking at? What am I thinking about when I look at this stuff? Well, that's about enough time to spend on Rothko. As I say, he's not easy to talk about. I've done the best I can to try to help you get at what this stuff is. But any questions you'd like to ask me? Yes, in the back.
The 1670, is that part of the title or is that the date with the title?
It's a title.
Thank you for asking that question, because I was thinking of saying something about that. Remember now, Rothko is Jewish. And even though he's not overtly Jewish, I don't think he ever went to temple, he's deeply engaged in Jewish mysticism. If you're acquainted with the Old Testament, there is numerical symbolism in the Old Testament. The number 6 represents incompletion, and the number 7 represents fullness and completion. I don't frankly think it's an accident that the measurement of that painting is all 6s. But who knows? I'm not ready to say that was his intention. It might just be an accident. But given the nature of the painting, what happened to his life, I think there's something there to be thought about. Any other questions I can help you with? Yes?
You began with a statement at 11 about the painter not going to a Scandinavian country and still painting Scandinavian landscape.
Yeah.
I don't understand that. I mean, how did he?
He saw other painters paint Norwegian landscape. In Scandinavia, that he painted was Norway, which is, of course, the one that's most irregular terrain. Now, if you grew up in Holland, wouldn't you look forward to seeing something like Norway? But I think he worked from other painters' work. That's all I can imagine about it.
And you've probably seen these. Are they good?
I have honestly haven't seen any of them. They're not his most famous works. You know, as we treat these artists, remember, to teach art history, I literally have to teach hundreds and even thousands of works. I can't know everything about every artist I'm talking about. And I can't see every work they've done. And in Ruisdael's case, he was a very productive painter. There are hundreds and literally hundreds of his paintings that are available. How that happened, I think it just was a marketing device. You know, his clientele are Dutch, and they put these things in their living room. And you know, you want a view of Haarlem, of the bleaching fields, or do you want a Scandinavian fjord and so on? I don't know. Any other questions I can help you with? Well, thank you all for coming to this last belated lecture. I appreciate it. I hope I see many of you next spring. I've already starting to think through some of the pairings. I'm probably going to start off with Andrew Wyeth. I've been showing you a lot of contemporary art, and I wanted you to see two contemporary artists who are really serious realists. One of them representing the country, Andrew Wyeth, and one of them representing the city, who's also a realist. Anyway, I'm working through other pairings. I'm going to try to have architecture in this course sometime or other. So we're going to try to come up with a couple architects as well for the spring. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you in the spring.